My time in Ravenwood Manor. My name is Sarah Bennett, and my husband David and I recently moved into a grand old mansion in Ravenwood, Virginia. Ravenwood Manor had been abandoned for years before we purchased it, drawn by its stately architecture and rich history. Little did we know, it also came with a haunting past. The first few weeks in Ravenwood Manor were like a dream. The house, with its high ceilings and intricate woodwork, was stunning. We spent our days renovating and decorating, turning the ancient manor into our dream home. The locals, however, avoided the house, whispering about its dark history and the spirit that supposedly haunted it. One evening, as I was unpacking boxes in the library, I found an old journal hidden behind a row of dusty books. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor Whitfield, who had lived in the house in the early 1900s. As I read her entries, I discovered that Eleanor had suffered greatly during her time in Ravenwood Manor. Eleanor's husband, Richard, had been a wealthy but cruel man. According to her journal, he had locked Eleanor in the attic for weeks at a time, punishing her for imagined slights. She wrote of feeling watched, of hearing whispers in the night, and of seeing shadows move in the corners of her vision. Her final entry was a plea for help, written just days before she disappeared without a trace. I felt a chill run down my spine as I closed the journal. That night I was jolted awake by a loud thud coming from the attic. David was still asleep, so I decided to investigate on my own. As I climbed the creaky stairs, the air grew colder, and my heart raced with fear. When I reached the attic, I saw a shadowy figure standing by the window. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. I froze in place, unable to move or scream. The figure turned slowly to face me, and I felt a wave of intense sadness wash over me. I managed to whisper, "Eleanor?" The figure nodded slowly, then pointed to a corner of the attic. I followed her gesture and saw an old trunk. Inside, I found a collection of letters and photographs, along with a small, ornate box. The letters revealed that Richard had indeed been abusive, and that Eleanor had been planning to escape with her lover, a man named James. The box contained a locket with a picture of Eleanor and James, along with a small note that read, "Together forever, in life and death." It was clear that Eleanor had loved James deeply, and that their plan to escape had been thwarted. As I closed the box, the shadowy figure of Eleanor began to fade. She gave me a sad smile before disappearing completely. The next day, I showed David the journal and the letters. He was just as disturbed as I was, and we decided to do some research on the history of the house. We discovered that Richard had been found dead in the house, an apparent suicide, shortly after Eleanor's disappearance. There were rumors that Eleanor's spirit had driven him to madness, but her body was never found. We decided to hold a small ceremony in the attic, placing the locket and the letters in a box and burying it in the garden. As we said a prayer for Eleanor's soul, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The house felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. Since that day, we haven't experienced any strange occurrences in Ravenwood Manor. The oppressive atmosphere is gone, replaced by a sense of tranquility. I like to think that Eleanor has finally found peace, and that she and James are together at last. Months later, I received a call from a local historian who had heard about our experience. He was fascinated by the story and wanted to document it for his research on haunted locations. He came to visit us, and we shared everything we had discovered about Eleanor and Richard. The historian, Dr. Thomas, was particularly interested in the letters we found. He believed they could provide clues about other unresolved hauntings in the area. As we discussed the details, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if Eleanor's story was not yet completely resolved. One evening, while Dr. Thomas was still visiting, we decided to explore the attic once more. We hoped to find any additional evidence that might help us understand Eleanor's plight better. As we searched through the dusty relics, I stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the floorboards. Inside, there was a small, tattered book, Eleanor's diary from her final days. The diary revealed that Eleanor had been desperate to escape Richard's abuse. She wrote about secret meetings with James and their plans to run away together. On the night of their planned escape, Richard had discovered their intentions. In a fit of rage, he had confronted Eleanor, leading to a tragic altercation. Eleanor's last entry was a heart-wrenching farewell to James, expressing her undying love and regret that they could not be together in life. As I read her words, tears filled my eyes. I could feel her pain and sorrow, as if she were standing beside me. Dr. Thomas suggested we hold a more formal ceremony to honor Eleanor and James. We gathered in the garden, where we had buried the locket and letters. This time, we invited a local priest to bless the ground and say a few words for the departed souls. As the priest recited the prayers, the air grew warm, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. It felt as though Eleanor's spirit was finally at peace. Dr. Thomas recorded the entire event, hoping it would bring some closure to the haunting legend of Ravenwood Manor. In the weeks that followed, the house continued to feel peaceful and welcoming. We no longer sensed any presence or heard whispers in the night. Ravenwood Manor had become a true home for us, free from the shadows of the past. Though we never forgot Eleanor and James, we felt comforted knowing they were together in the afterlife. The story of Ravenwood Manor became a local legend, and visitors often came to hear the tale of love, tragedy, and redemption. And so, the spirit of Ravenwood Manor was finally laid to rest, allowing us to live our lives in peace and happiness. The Haunting of Oakwood House. My name is Emily Thompson, and I recently moved into Oakwood House, a beautiful Victorian mansion in Oakwood, Massachusetts. After inheriting the house from my great-aunt Lydia, I decided to leave my apartment in the city behind and start a new chapter in my life. Oakwood House, with its charming architecture and expansive gardens, seemed like the perfect place to do so. However, I soon discovered that the house had a dark, hidden history. The first few days in Oakwood House were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning and unpacking, trying to get a feel for the place. Despite its age, the house was in remarkably good condition. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I would often hear soft footsteps echoing through the hallways and feel a cold breeze pass by, even when all the windows were closed. One evening, as I was exploring the attic, I stumbled upon an old trunk. Inside, I found a collection of letters, photographs, and a faded diary. The letters were addressed to my great-aunt Lydia from a woman named Abigail, who had lived in the house in the late 1800s. Intrigued, I began to read Abigail's diary, hoping to learn more about the history of Oakwood House. Abigail's entries were filled with tales of sorrow and despair. She wrote about her husband, Samuel, who had become increasingly distant and cruel after the death of their daughter, Elizabeth. Abigail described how Samuel would lock himself in his study for days, muttering to himself and writing frantically in his journal. She also mentioned hearing whispers in the night and seeing shadows moving around the house. The final entry in Abigail's diary was the most chilling. She wrote of a terrible night when Samuel had gone mad, accusing her of conspiring against him. In his rage, he had taken her life, along with his own. The diary ended with a plea for help, as Abigail felt her soul would never find peace. After reading the diary, I felt a deep sadness for Abigail and a growing sense of dread about Oakwood House. That night, I was awoken by the sound of crying coming from the attic. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way upstairs. As I entered the attic, the air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. In the corner of the attic, I saw a shadowy figure of a woman, her face obscured by darkness. She was weeping softly, her shoulders shaking with sorrow. I took a step closer, and the figure looked up, revealing a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes. I froze, unable to move or speak. "Abigail," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure nodded slowly, then pointed to a spot on the floor. I followed her gesture and noticed a loose floorboard. With shaking hands, I pried it open and found a small, leather-bound journal inside. It was Samuel's journal, filled with his descent into madness. He had become obsessed with dark rituals, believing they would bring Elizabeth back to life. His writings were erratic and disturbing, revealing his growing insanity. Realizing that Abigail's spirit was trapped in the house, I decided to help her find peace. I spent the next few days researching the history of the house and contacting local historians. Despite my efforts, I found no clear solution to release Abigail's spirit. The strange occurrences continued. Every night, I would hear the sound of crying and feel a cold presence near me. One particularly cold night, I woke to find the shadowy figure of Abigail standing at the foot of my bed. She looked at me with such sorrow that it broke my heart. I knew I had to do something more. One day, while walking through the local cemetery, I found Abigail's gravestone, overgrown and neglected. I spent hours cleaning it, talking to her as if she were there. I told her that I believed her story and that I would do whatever it took to help her find peace. That night, I returned to the house feeling a strange sense of hope. However, as I lay in bed, the feeling of dread returned. The whispers were louder, the footsteps more pronounced. I could feel Abigail's desperation. A few days later, I decided to leave Oakwood House. I packed my belongings, leaving behind everything that reminded me of the haunting. As I drove away, I glanced back at the mansion, seeing Abigail's figure in the window. I whispered a silent goodbye, hoping that someday someone would be able to help her find the peace she deserved. Oakwood House still stands, a beautiful mansion with a tragic past. Every now and then, I hear stories from new occupants about strange occurrences, and I wonder if Abigail is still there, waiting for someone to help her move on. As for me, I've found a new place to call home, but the memories of Oakwood House and Abigail's sorrowful spirit will stay with me forever. The Haunting of Lawson House. My name is Michael Carter, and my wife Lisa and I recently moved into a beautiful Victorian house in Asheville, North Carolina. The house had a charm that was hard to resist, with its wraparound porch, tall windows, and sprawling garden. We were excited to start our new life there, envisioning it as the perfect place to raise our future children. However, from the moment we moved in, something felt off. Initially, it was small things: doors opening on their own, lights flickering, and strange cold spots that seemed to follow us around. We chalked it up to the quirks of an old house, but soon the incidents escalated. One night, we heard a loud crash coming from the basement. Lisa was too frightened to go down, so I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the dark, musty space. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. At the bottom of the stairs, I found an old, dusty mirror that had fallen off the wall. As I lifted it back into place, I noticed something strange in the reflection: a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded as I hurried back upstairs, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The next day, I decided to investigate the history of the house. I discovered that it was built in the late 1800s by Henry Lawson, a wealthy businessman. Henry's life had been marked by tragedy. His wife, Margaret, had died under mysterious circumstances, and his 2 children had vanished without a trace. Henry himself had died in the house, reportedly of a broken heart. Local legends claimed that his spirit still roamed the halls, searching for his lost family. That evening, we set up a small altar in the living room, placing candles and photographs of the Lawson family that we had found in the attic. We lit the candles and sat in silence, hoping for some sign from Henry. The room grew colder, and we could feel a presence around us. "Henry," I called out softly, "we know you're here. We want to help you find peace. Please show us a sign." The candles flickered, and we heard a faint whisper. "Margaret, the children." The voice was filled with sorrow, and we felt a deep sense of sadness. We decided to explore the attic further, searching for any clues about what had happened to Margaret and the children. Hidden behind a wall panel, we found an old, locked chest. Inside, we discovered letters and journals that told a heartbreaking story. Margaret had been suffering from a severe illness, and in her despair she had taken her own life and the lives of her children. Henry had found them too late, and the guilt and grief had consumed him. He had spent the rest of his life searching for a way to reunite with his family in the afterlife. With this new understanding, we held another ceremony, this time in the attic. We placed the letters and photographs in a small box and buried it in the garden, along with a note asking for peace for the Lawson family. As we finished the ceremony, we felt a sense of release. The air seemed lighter, and the oppressive atmosphere was gone. After the ceremony, we decided to document our experience. I reached out to a local historian, Dr. Emily Harris, who had shown interest in the house's history. She visited us, and we shared everything we had discovered. Dr. Harris was fascinated by the story and suggested we explore the basement, where the disturbances had started. In the basement, we found an old, hidden room. Inside, there were more letters and a small, intricately carved box. The letters were from Henry to Margaret, expressing his undying love and his despair over losing her and the children. The box contained a locket with pictures of the Lawson family and a note that read, "Together forever, in life and death." It was clear that Henry's love for his family had transcended death. We decided to hold a final ceremony, this time with Dr. Harris's help. We buried the locket and letters in the garden, hoping to bring closure to the restless spirits. As we said our final prayers, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and the atmosphere in the house changed. It felt as if a heavy weight had been lifted, and a sense of peace settled over us. From that day on, we experienced no further disturbances. The house, once filled with sorrow and despair, became a place of love and tranquility. We believed that Henry had finally found peace, reunited with his beloved Margaret and their children. The haunting had ended, leaving behind a sense of serenity that we cherished. Dr. Harris documented our story, and it became a local legend, attracting visitors who were fascinated by the tale of love, loss, and redemption. Our house, once a place of haunting, had become a symbol of enduring love and the power of forgiveness. Haunted house experiences. This all took place in the mid-90s in a little town called Ottawa in Kansas. These are all true stories of experiences I had while living in that house. I will describe the layout of the house. From front to back, you walk into the den. Moving forward, you enter the kitchen, with a doorway to your right that leads to a bathroom and a master bedroom. If you continue through the kitchen, it leads to a dining room and living room on the left. If you go through the dining room further to the back of the house, it leads to a doorless room that we used for a computer room, and then 2 more bedrooms in the back. I put all this here because over the years family members switched rooms. The first experience happened not long after moving in. At that time, my mom had started a new relationship, and we moved in with him. His mom also lived there, and she had the master bedroom at the front of the house. My mom and her new boyfriend had the room at the very back of the house, and I was in the room next to them. One night, I heard all my mom's music boxes start playing. She had these painted clowns and such that sat on satin pillows and played music. They weren't creepy to me until this night. Anyways, I hear them all going off, and in my kid mind, I'm just pissed my mom is in there playing when she told me it's bedtime. But they just kept playing, all at the same time. It was years later that she, my mom, finally told me she wasn't playing with them. Experience 2 was probably the scariest experience of my life. I was still in one of the back bedrooms, but by this time, my step-grandma had moved out, so my mom and her boyfriend were in the master bedroom, at the front of the house. I was alone in the back. I have siblings, but they were back and forth between my mom and dad, so at this point, I was the only kid there. My mom and I had just come home from Walmart, and she had gotten me The Nightmare Before Christmas on VHS. Yep, showing my age. It was late, so she said I could watch it the next day, so I put it on my dresser and went to bed. It was still wrapped in cellophane and still in the Walmart bag. As I was falling asleep, I heard the plastic of the bag, and even with my nightlight, I couldn't see anything. I was scared though, so I gently tossed my big white cat, Muffin Man, onto the floor at the foot of my bed, in hopes that he would scare whatever it was away. Instead, he took off like a bat out of hell. I kept hearing the plastic and was literally petrified. I couldn't even scream, I was so scared. I eventually woke up, and when I did, The movie was out of the case and on the floor. I simply can't explain how. Experience 3. I had a friend stay over, and this story still gives her chills. She had recently lost her mom in a car accident, and this was another attempt at her sleeping over. She would try, but she missed her mom and just wanted to be with her family. But this time, she stayed the whole night. The experience itself wasn't scary for me, but I had a poster of the crow. It was my first poster ever, and I loved it. But when I woke up, it was tacked upside down. I wouldn't have done that to Brandon Lee, and when my friend saw, she turned white and never spent the night again. So, I know it wasn't her. At that time, my little brother was living with us again, but there's no way he could have reached the tacks at the top of the poster. My fourth experience was probably the second scariest. We had cats. Muffin Man still loved me, LOL. But one day, in the middle of the day, my brother was down the street playing football at the school, and I was home alone with my mom. I was in the computer room and she was in the kitchen. The day before, my little brother had been pretending he had caught an alien. He had a huge plaster ET piggy bank that was probably 1.52 FT tall. It was ridiculous, really, LOL, but he had a rope tied around it because he had caught it, you know? So I'm at the computer, and all of a sudden, I hear a loud crash from the rooms in the back, and here comes my cat, Jara, with the other end of the rope tied around her tail. Mind you, Jara was a tortie. They're kind of known for just being all around crazy, but for anything to keep that cat still long enough to tie something around her tail is kind of mind-boggling, but something did and broke off E.T.'s head in the process. I can't explain any of these experiences. My mom ended up having a priest come in and bless our home. He stole my stone collection and dream catcher. Still pissed about that. But we did a little research and found that the property had burned down. I can't remember the dates now, but I don't think the spirit was demonic. I think it was a little girl named Margaret. Curious what everyone else thinks. I'll do a little digging and see if I can find any info about the fire. My experiences in the paranormal, I would say I am very aware of the paranormal and things of that nature. My parents' house, it's over 100 years old, and it's next to the Catholic church where my mom, brother, and I were baptized at. Now this is where it gets interesting. In the 1950s, during the middle of a sermon, the priest who was living in the house attached to the church, he was having a heart attack or something of that nature. The people living in the house at the time, they brought him to their bedroom, what is now our living room, where he later died. Years later, when I was about 8 or 9, I had just woken up from a nap on our recliner in our living room, and I was still groggy. I remember Mom had a plant in the middle of the doorway for some reason, and as I turned my head to see where I was going when trying to not bump into the plant for 2 seconds, I saw a man without a face but wearing a hat. IDK if it was a trucker or baseball cap, but it was a hat, maybe 3 feet in front of me. The only reason I know it was real is because a year later or so, I was watching TV in Mom's room, and I was about to get up to go to the bathroom, and when I looked at the door, I saw the same guy standing there for a couple of seconds, and then he was gone. I've heard things too, but nothing was as creepy as those experiences, besides hearing my mom's voice twice. Once when she was at work, I heard her call my name from the dryer room downstairs, and I asked Dad if Mom was home, and he said no. The other time, my mom, Dad, and I were all home, and I heard her call my name from the top floor, but it didn't feel right. I didn't respond for a couple of minutes, because it felt off, and I know never to respond if it doesn't feel right. I asked Mom if she called my name a few minutes ago, and she said no. Those aren't even the weirdest things that happened. I have a long-distance girlfriend. Her and I talked on the phone every single day for just a little over a year before we physically met. She'd always tell me about how she'd always see the previous owner walking around the house, who died naturally on the patio, but she never once described what he looked like. The day happens where we finally meet wonderfully, and everything goes normal, until I wake up at about 3-ish in the morning to take a piss. She's still asleep, and I get up and walk past the closet next to the bathroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw what looked like a guy with glasses wearing a blue flannel but didn't see any legs. It took me a second to register what I just saw, and I looked where I saw him, and he was gone. I take my piss, not really worried about it, go back to the room and asked my girlfriend, "So you know the guy? Does he wear glasses and a blue flannel?" She said, "Yeah, why?" I said, "Well, I just fucking saw him." That still gives me chills to this day, almost 3 years later. Last summer, I even asked her if she ever saw him near me. She said she saw him standing behind me as we were cooking, and that gave me even more chills. This was the first time since high school that I had seen anything, and it's also the last time currently that I've seen anything. I don't know what it is because I'm not religious anymore, more agnostic, and this shit creeps me out and fascinates me at the same time. My grandfather's exorcism experience. A bit of background. My grandfather passed away back in 2013 from cancer, but in his lifetime, he was a decent guy who helped a lot of people in various ways. After he met my grandmother, they both joined the Army. They served in Japanese-based U.S. Army hospitals during the Vietnam conflict, helping to save a lot of guys. After his time with the Army, he joined the Air Force for a stint. This all helped him to get his nursing degree and become an esthetician. After the Air Force, he became a clergyman at their church, and years later, he would become a Russian Orthodox priest. For over 40 years, he served as a priest. BTW, just for reference, in most sects of Orthodox Christianity, they allow clergy to marry unless they were a bishop or higher. My grandfather was the sort of priest that the archdiocese would call up and say, "Father, we have these people in Alabama. They're believers, but they have no church in 100 miles they can attend. Will you go there and help organize something?" Then, what would start as people holding liturgy in someone's living room with 24 people would become a full-on church. He repeated that more times than I've ever gotten a straight answer on. The only thing I thought he was an ass for was always putting the church before his wife and 3 kids. Anyway, it was the mid-70s, and my grandfather had moved my mom, my aunt, and my grandmother to New Jersey to help one of these struggling churches that were without a priest. My mom was about 5 or 6, and she remembers this point in time pretty well. One day, my grandfather was contacted by his bishop, who told him that his assistance was needed with something very serious. He told my grandfather that there is this young girl, 17 years old, she is a gypsy, and her family brought her to the monastery claiming that she is possessed. The monks there tell me they believe this to be serious. Will you go there to help them? My grandfather had been a priest for several years by that point, but understand that most priests who serve their entire lives are never asked to help exorcise a demon. Actually, the Roman Catholics require special permission from the Vatican to perform any exorcism rites. He agreed without knowing what he was walking into. The story I was told about the girl was that her name was Juliana, and her family were gypsies, travelers. She had come from a family that was heavily involved in occult practices, which shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with that culture. Juliana was married to a man from another family in their clan. I don't know much about him besides that he was a bit older than her and he also practiced a lot of magic. Juliana's family started becoming concerned when she started acting different. She was very moody, aggressive, wrathful, and just straight up mean. As time went on, her fits would get worse, and she would scream hurtful things at people for being asked simple questions. But the family was terrified when the caravan they lived in would rattle, rise up off the ground a few feet, and drop to the ground, and even on many occasions seeing things fly off the wall or out of cupboards and break against the wall. They tried their own rites and rituals to cleanse whatever darkness they believed was possessing Juliana, but nothing had worked. So they went to this monastery, desperately seeking help. This is where Grandpa gets involved. He said, when he got there, everyone was in the church. Another priest and a handful of monks, all preparing holy water, oils, saying prayers for help with the god's strength. In the back of the church were several curious lay people that live and help work on the monastery grounds. Then a bunch of Juliana's family. I guess they had her in a room with a few family members till they were ready. They bring her in. sit her on a chair in front of the altar. My grandfather said that he felt the air get thicker and she seemed pissed and was just talking shit, laughing, spitting, trying to scratch and kick. They had a few people restraining her as she started getting violent. They semi-surrounded her, and they began praying and performing the full-on exorcism rite. As the progressed, she began growling, and he said, things started happening. The chairs in the church began rattling, shaking, then moving on their own before levitating off the floor. Those curious people and even some of Juliana's family were so scared that they ran out of the church. He told it they continued praying and repeating the prayers over and over for several hours as things continued to erratically move on their own, and Juliana continued to curse them and their God, spit, scratch, and target each person and try to get in their head and break their concentration. But they continued and praying and asking God and every saint they could think of to help them banish this thing back where it came from and to leave this girl. Then, she suddenly sat back rigidly and swung her head back. Then her face began to contort and take on this inhuman shape, while her mouth opened wider than a human's mouth can expand without completely separating the jawbone. And without her mouth moving, a voice came from within her, and in this deep, growly, loud, demonic voice said, "Leave me alone. I am happy with her." But this voice didn't speak in English or any other commonly spoken language. It spoke in a dead language that is native to the region of Romania and the steppes of Russia, the Slavonic language. The monks especially knew this language because many old church manuscripts are written in this nearly ancient language. This moment frightened everyone in the room, but they knew they couldn't stop now. Not long after, Juliana passed out. She was unconscious, and they couldn't wake her. She was breathing, but she was in rough shape. So, they brought her to the hospital. She was stable but wouldn't wake up. She slept for about 2 weeks. Then she woke up one day. She was so confused. She didn't understand why she was in the hospital. She had no memory of the exorcism at all. In fact, she couldn't remember the last year and a half of her life. The very last thing she could remember was being in her trailer. She said, "I was sitting at the table while my husband slept in our bed, when I noticed something from the corner of my eye. I turned and I see my husband sleeping on his back, but there was this black cloud that was flowing out of his mouth and hovering above him in bed. Before I could scream, this black cloud rushed at me. Now I'm here." My grandfather was changed forever after that night. My mom tells me that she was 7 or so at the time, and she remembers that her father didn't speak for at least a couple of weeks, and he wore this somber look on his face. He would move on, but it had a lasting impression. My mom says he didn't tell her the story until she was a teenager, and he was trying to warn her off of dabbling in the occult, as you never know what you're inviting in. My grandfather wasn't the kind of guy that liked to make up stories. Actually, he liked to call people out for embellishment. He usually didn't have a lot to say unless you asked him about something. He was very intelligent and read a lot. He also traveled across the U.S. and had been to various countries over his lifetime. He served in 2 branches of the military and had a career as a medical professional. I'd say he has some level of credibility. The Haunted Apartment on Birchwood Lane. My name is Jessica, and I'm a 32-year-old nurse living in a modest apartment on Birchwood Lane. I moved here about a year ago, hoping for a fresh start after a rough breakup. The apartment itself seemed perfect, affordable, cozy, and in a quiet neighborhood. Little did I know, it had a history that would come to haunt me. It all started with small, unsettling incidents. At first, it was just the occasional misplaced item. I'm a neat freak, so I have a pretty good idea where everything is supposed to be. But I would find my keys in the kitchen when I distinctly remembered leaving them on the coffee table, or my books moved from the shelf to the floor. I chalked it up to being distracted or stressed. Then came the noises. Strange, unexplainable sounds in the middle of the night. I would hear faint footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway, the creaking of floorboards, and a soft humming sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the building settling or the neighbors making noise. One night, I was on the phone with my best friend Emily. We were catching up, and I casually mentioned the odd occurrences. Emily, always the skeptic, laughed it off and said it was probably just my imagination running wild. I laughed too, trying to convince myself she was right, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The turning point came about 3 months after I moved in. It was a particularly cold night, and I had just settled into bed with a good book. As I read, I felt a sudden chill in the room, much colder than usual. I glanced at the thermostat, but it read a normal temperature. Then, out of nowhere, the lights started flickering. I sat up, my heart pounding, and tried to calm myself down. "It's just a power surge," I told myself. But the flickering continued, and then the bedroom door, which I had closed, slowly creaked open. I froze, staring at the dark hallway beyond the door. I could feel a presence, something watching me from the shadows. Summoning all my courage, I got out of bed and walked towards the door. I reached for the light switch, but the lights went out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness. Panic set in, and I fumbled for my phone to use the flashlight. As I turned it on, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, with indistinct features, but I could feel its eyes on me. I let out a scream and the figure vanished. The lights flickered back on, and I was alone again, my heart racing and my mind spinning. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment alone that night. I grabbed my coat and rushed out, heading to Emily's place. She was surprised to see me so late, but when I told her what happened, she didn't laugh. She could see the fear in my eyes. The next day, Emily and I did some research on the apartment building. We found out that a previous tenant, a young woman, had mysteriously disappeared several years ago. Her body was never found, and the case remained unsolved. There were rumors among the neighbors that her spirit still lingered, unable to rest. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Emily and I contacted a local paranormal investigator. He came to the apartment with his equipment and began to investigate. He set up cameras, motion detectors, and other gadgets I didn't even recognize. As night fell, we sat in the living room watching the monitors intently. For a while, nothing happened. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. We could see our breath in the air, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, the motion detectors went off, and we saw it on the monitor. The same shadowy figure I had seen before, moving slowly down the hallway. The investigator tried to communicate with it, asking who it was and what it wanted. The figure stopped, and for a moment it seemed like nothing would happen. But then, a cold, hollow voice echoed through the apartment saying, "Help me." The investigator asked how we could help, but the figure faded away, and the temperature returned to normal. We sat there, stunned, trying to process what we had just witnessed. The investigator suggested that the spirit might be trying to communicate something about its disappearance, and that it needed closure to move on. Over the next few weeks, we continued to experience strange occurrences. The figure appeared several more times, each time uttering the same plea for help. We decided to dig deeper into the history of the building, hoping to find some clue that could help the spirit find peace. We discovered that the missing woman had been involved in a tumultuous relationship with a man who had a history of violence. He had been a suspect in her disappearance but was never charged due to lack of evidence. Determined to help, we reached out to a local historian who had access to old police records and other documents. Through our research, we uncovered new evidence that pointed to the ex-boyfriend's involvement in the woman's disappearance. Armed with this information, we went to the police and convinced them to reopen the case. They conducted a new investigation and eventually found enough evidence to arrest the ex-boyfriend. The night he was arrested, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. The air felt lighter, and the sense of unease that had plagued me for months seemed to lift. That night, as I lay in bed, I saw the figure one last time. It stood at the foot of my bed, its features clearer than ever before. It was the woman, and she looked at me with a sad but grateful expression. "Thank you," she whispered, before fading away into the darkness. After that, the strange occurrences stopped. The apartment felt like a normal, peaceful place again. Emily and I were relieved, but also deeply moved by the experience. It wasn't something either of us would forget anytime soon. living in that apartment taught me that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. The spirits of those who have suffered injustice may linger, seeking help to find peace. And while it was a terrifying experience, I'm glad I was able to help that woman finally find the closure she deserved. The Haunting of Evergreen Manor. My name is Sarah, and I'm a 35-year-old single mom. After my divorce, I moved with my 10-year-old son Max to a quaint town in the Midwest. We found an old house, Evergreen Manor, that seemed perfect. It was near Max's new school, and the rent was affordable. The house was large and a bit run down, but it had charm and character. I thought it would be a fresh start for us. Little did I know, the house held dark secrets that would soon turn our lives upside down. From the moment we moved in, things felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away, just a sense of unease that hung in the air. Max seemed to notice it too. He'd often say he felt like someone was watching him. I chalked it up to nerves about the new school and the new house. One night, about a week after we moved in, I was woken up by the sound of footsteps. I groggily assumed it was Max getting up to go to the bathroom. But then I remembered that Max's room was on the other side of the house, and the footsteps were coming from the attic above my room. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I lay there, frozen, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just the house settling, or perhaps a raccoon had gotten in. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to Max. He looked at me with wide eyes and said he'd heard them too. He also said he'd been seeing a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed at night. My heart sank. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him it was just his imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to do some research on the house. I went to the local library and found some old records. Evergreen Manor had been built in the early 1900s by a wealthy family, the Thompsons. Tragedy struck the family when their youngest daughter, Emily, died under mysterious circumstances. Some rumors suggested she had fallen down the stairs, while others hinted at something more sinister. The family moved away shortly after her death, and the house had changed hands many times since then. Each new owner stayed for only a short period before selling the house, often at a loss. Armed with this new information, I went back to the house with a sense of dread. That night I tucked Max into bed and tried to reassure him that everything would be okay. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I heard the footsteps again, this time closer, like they were right outside my door. I mustered up all my courage and decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly opened my bedroom door. The hallway was dark and silent. I made my way to the attic stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I took a deep breath and started to climb. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step. When I reached the top, I shone my flashlight around the attic. It was empty, just a dusty old space filled with cobwebs and forgotten boxes. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw her. Standing in the corner was a young girl, dressed in a white nightgown. Her face was pale, and her eyes were dark and hollow. She looked at me with an expression of sadness and fear. I froze, unable to move or speak. The girl raised her hand and pointed to a corner of the attic. Then, she vanished. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what I had just seen. Finally, I forced myself to move and went to the corner where she had pointed. There, hidden behind some old boxes, I found a small, dusty trunk. I opened it and found old photographs and letters. The letters were from Emily Thompson, written to her parents. They spoke of her loneliness and fear, of something dark and evil that haunted her dreams. My hands shook as I read them, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to do something to help her. The next day, I reached out to a local historian, Mrs. Anderson, who specialized in the town's history. I told her about the noises and the ghostly figure, and she agreed to come to the house. Mrs. Anderson arrived with a bundle of sage and some candles. She explained that we needed to perform a cleansing ritual to help Emily find peace. We started in the attic, lighting the sage and walking around the space, chanting prayers for Emily's soul. As we moved through the house, the air grew lighter, and the oppressive feeling began to lift. We went through each room, finally ending in Max's bedroom. As we finished the ritual, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Mrs. Anderson assured me that Emily's spirit had been trapped in the house, but that we had helped her find peace. That night, for the first time since we moved in, the house was silent. Max slept peacefully, and I didn't hear any footsteps or feel any sense of being watched. The next morning, I found a small, delicate locket on my nightstand. It was old and tarnished, with an engraving of the letter E. I knew it was Emily's way of thanking me. I kept the locket as a reminder of the young girl who had been trapped in the house for so long. Life slowly returned to normal. Max made new friends at school, and I started to feel at home in Evergreen Manor. The house no longer felt eerie or oppressive. Instead, it felt like a place of peace and healing. We had helped a lost soul find rest, and in doing so, we had found a new beginning for ourselves. The experience left me with a deeper understanding of the unseen world, and a sense of respect for the spirits that linger among us. The entity in the old farmhouse. My name is Mark, and I'm a 28-year-old history teacher. I've always been fascinated by old buildings and the stories they hold. So, when I found an old farmhouse for sale in the countryside, I jumped at the chance to buy it. The house was over 100 years old, with creaky wooden floors and a wraparound porch. It was a fixer-upper, but I saw potential in it. Little did I know, the house had a dark past that would soon reveal itself in terrifying ways. I moved in during the summer, hoping to spend my vacation fixing up the place. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning, painting, and making minor repairs. But then, strange things started to happen. It began with small, almost unnoticeable events. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in odd places. Doors would creak open on their own, and I'd hear faint whispers in the middle of the night. One evening, as I was working on the porch, I heard a noise coming from inside the house. It sounded like footsteps, but I was sure I was alone. I grabbed a flashlight and went inside to investigate. The house was dark and silent. I checked every room, but found nothing out of the ordinary. I chalked it up to the house settling and went back to work. But the noises continued, growing louder and more frequent. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, whispers in the attic, and sometimes a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. One night I woke up to the sound of something scratching at my bedroom door. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and opened the door. There was nothing there, but the scratching continued, this time coming from inside the walls. Desperate for answers, I did some research on the house. I discovered that it had once belonged to a family called the Millers. They had lived there for several generations, but the house had been abandoned for decades after a series of tragic events. The last owner, Jacob Miller, had been accused of practicing dark magic and had died under mysterious circumstances. Some said he had summoned an evil entity that still haunted the house. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, Jenna. She agreed to come to the house and conduct an investigation. Jenna arrived with her equipment and set up cameras and audio recorders throughout the house. We spent the night going room to room, asking questions and trying to make contact with whatever was haunting the place. As the night went on, the activity escalated. We heard footsteps, whispers, and even saw shadowy figures moving through the house. Jenna captured several EVPs, or electronic voice phenomena, that seemed to respond to our questions. One EVP in particular sent chills down my spine. When asked who was haunting the house, a voice replied, "Jacob." Jenna suggested we perform a cleansing ritual to try and banish the entity. We gathered in the living room, lighting candles and burning sage. As we chanted prayers, the air grew colder, and the room filled with an oppressive energy. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, and we heard a loud crash from the kitchen. We rushed to the kitchen and found all the cabinets and drawers open, their contents scattered across the floor. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. Jenna continued the ritual, her voice strong and unwavering. As she recited the final incantation, a loud, guttural growl filled the room. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive energy began to dissipate. The candles flickered back to life, and the house fell silent. We had succeeded in banishing the entity. The next morning, I found a dusty old book in the attic, hidden behind a loose board. It was Jacob Miller's journal, filled with dark spells and rituals. I took it to Jenna, who agreed to take it and keep it safe, away from anyone who might try to use its contents. With the entity gone, the house felt different. It was no longer filled with an oppressive energy. Instead, it felt like a home. The shadow in the basement. It was a quiet Sunday evening, and I was home alone while my family was out of town visiting relatives. I had spent the day catching up on chores and decided to relax with a good book before bed. The house was eerily silent, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. As I sat in the living room, I suddenly heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, listening intently. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had started. I tried to dismiss it as the house settling or perhaps a stray animal that had somehow found its way in. But the noise came again, this time louder and more distinct. It was a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like metal against concrete. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight and a baseball bat for good measure, I made my way to the basement door. The basement was always a creepy place, filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and the occasional cobweb. I slowly descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The basement was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. I shone the flashlight around, trying to find the source of the noise. The basement appeared empty, but the feeling of unease grew stronger. I walked towards the far corner, where an old rusted metal cabinet stood. As I approached, I noticed the cabinet door was slightly ajar. With a trembling hand, I pulled the door open, revealing a collection of old tools and gardening supplies. Just as I was about to close it, I heard the scraping noise again, this time right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but saw nothing. My heart was pounding, and I decided it was best to leave the basement. As I turned to head back upstairs, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a dark, shadowy figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. It was barely visible in the dim light, but I could make out its tall, slender shape. I took a step back, my mind racing with fear. The shadow figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me. Summoning all my courage, I shouted, "Who's there?" There was no response, just an oppressive silence. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure. As I reached the stairs, the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, disappearing from sight. I raced up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked it and leaned against it, my heart still racing. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was something more. I called my parents and told them what had happened. They were concerned, but assured me that it was probably nothing to worry about. That night, I slept with the lights on, and the basement door securely locked. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and every little noise set my nerves on edge. The next day, I decided to do some research on the house's history, hoping to find some explanation for the shadowy figure. I discovered that the previous owner had been an elderly man who had lived alone for many years. He was a recluse and rarely left the house. According to the neighbors, he had been a bit of an oddball, always muttering to himself and keeping strange hours. He had died in the basement, and his body wasn't found for several days. The knowledge of the man's death in the basement only added to my unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that his restless spirit still lingered in the house. Over the next few weeks, I continued to hear strange noises coming from the basement, but I never saw the shadow figure again. Eventually, my family returned, and I felt a sense of relief. I told them about my experiences, and while they were sympathetic, they were also skeptical. We decided to have the house blessed by a priest, hoping to bring some peace to the restless spirit. The strange occurrences gradually subsided, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I never ventured into the basement alone again, and the sight of shadows always sent a shiver down my spine. The shadow in the basement had left its mark on me, a chilling reminder of the unknown and the things that go bump in the night. Before we start the second story, please subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this video. Also, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. The mysterious knocking. It was a cold and rainy Friday night when I found myself home alone for the first time in months. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me in charge of the house. I was looking forward to a relaxing evening of binge-watching my favorite shows and enjoying some much-needed solitude. I had just settled onto the couch with a bowl of popcorn when I heard the first knock. It was faint and seemed to come from the front door. I paused my show and listened, but the sound didn't repeat. I brushed it off as my imagination and resumed watching TV. A few minutes later, the knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I got up and cautiously approached the front door, peering through the peephole. The porch was empty, and the rain was falling heavily, creating a misty haze. I opened the door slightly and called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" There was no response, just the sound of the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. I closed the door and double-checked the lock before returning to the living room. As I sat down, my phone buzzed with a text message from my friend Sarah. "Hey, heard you're home alone. Want to hang out?" Relieved by the distraction, I replied, "Sure, come over." While waiting for Sarah, I decided to make some tea. As I filled the kettle, I heard the knocking again, this time coming from the back door. My heart raced as I slowly walked towards the kitchen door. Through the window, I could see the backyard, dimly lit by the porch light. There was no one there. I took a deep breath and opened the back door, peering into the darkness. The rain had intensified, and the wind howled through the trees. I called out again, but there was no answer. I closed the door and locked it, feeling a growing sense of unease. Just as I turned away from the door, my phone buzzed again. It was Sarah. "I'm here." I felt a wave of relief and hurried to the front door to let her in, but when I opened it, no one was there. I stepped outside, confused, and called her name. The only response was the rain and the distant roll of thunder. Panic started to set in as I texted Sarah, "Where are you? I don't see you." Her reply came almost instantly. "What do you mean? I'm still at home. I haven't left yet." My blood ran cold as I realized that whoever was knocking wasn't Sarah. I quickly locked the door and ran to the living room, grabbing my phone to call the police. As I dialed, the knocking resumed, this time louder and more frantic. It echoed through the house, coming from all directions: the front door, the back door, the windows. It was as if someone or something was trying to get in from every possible entrance. The dispatcher answered, and I frantically explained my situation. They assured me that an officer was on the way and instructed me to stay on the line. I grabbed a kitchen knife and huddled in the corner of the living room, my eyes darting around the room, expecting to see a figure appear at any moment. The knocking continued, relentless and unyielding. It was as if the house itself was alive, the walls reverberating with the sound. I could hear the rain pounding against the roof, the wind howling, and my own rapid breathing. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. The knocking stopped abruptly, and the house fell silent. A few minutes later, there was a loud knock on the front door, followed by a voice announcing, Police!" I cautiously opened the door to find two officers standing on the porch, their expressions serious. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but found no signs of anyone. The officers suggested that it might have been a prank, or my imagination playing tricks on me, given the stormy weather. They offered to stay nearby for the rest of the night, just in case. I thanked them and tried to calm my nerves. But the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the memory of the relentless knocking, and the sense that someone or something had been trying to get in. That night I slept with the lights on, my mind racing with fear and unanswered questions. The next day my parents returned, and I recounted the events to them. They were sympathetic but also skeptical, suggesting that it might have been the storm playing tricks on my senses. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real, and the memory of that terrifying night stayed with me long after the storm had passed. Months passed, and gradually, the intense fear began to subside. The memory of that night still lingered, but it no longer dominated my every thought. I learned to live with the unease, to manage it, but it never truly went away. Every time I heard a noise in the night or saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, the fear would flare up again, reminding me of how vulnerable we can be, even in the safety of our own homes. Even now, years later, the memory of that night still lingers. The image of the man standing by the back door trying to get in is forever etched in my mind. It's a reminder that safety is often an illusion, and that danger can come knocking when we least expect it. I still double-check the locks before going to bed, and I keep my phone close by, just in case. The experience changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of the fragility of the bubble we call home. I've shared this story with a few close friends and family members, hoping that by speaking it aloud, I might be able to lessen its hold on me. Each time, they listen with wide eyes and shared fear, understanding the terror of that night. But no matter how many times I tell it, the memory remains vivid, a dark chapter in the story of my life. Ultimately, the experience taught me to appreciate the moments of true safety and comfort, to cherish the times when the world feels secure. And while the fear may never fully go away, it serves as a reminder to stay vigilant, to protect myself and those I love, and to never take the illusion of safety for granted. The stranger in the window. When I was 16, my parents decided to take a weekend trip, leaving me home alone for the first time. I was thrilled about the freedom, planning to spend the time watching movies, playing video games, and indulging in junk food. I saw it as a mini vacation, a chance to enjoy some solitude and relaxation without any interruptions. Little did I know, the weekend would turn into a nightmare I would never forget. On the first night, I stayed up late watching a horror movie marathon. The storm outside only added to the eerie atmosphere. Around midnight, I heard a strange noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone was walking around the side of the house. I paused the movie and listened carefully, but the noise stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just an animal, or perhaps the wind. A few hours later, I decided to call it a night. As I was drifting off to sleep, I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder and closer. I got up and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The backyard was pitch black, and the only light came from the flickering street lamp at the end of our driveway. I decided to check the security cameras my dad had installed around the house. I went downstairs to the living room where the monitor was set up. As I scanned the footage, my heart nearly stopped. There, in the backyard, was a man standing by the back door. He was dressed in dark clothes, with a hood covering his face. He seemed to be trying to pick the lock. Panic set in. I grabbed my cell phone and called 911, explaining the situation in a trembling voice. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line. I watched the monitor, my eyes glued to the screen, praying the man would leave before he managed to get inside. The man continued to fumble with the lock for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he seemed to give up and started to walk around the side of the house. I heard a noise from the kitchen and realized he was trying to get in through the window. I ran to the kitchen and locked the window, hoping he wouldn't be able to break it. I could hear the sound of footsteps outside the window, and then a tapping noise. My heart pounded as I listened to the sound of glass being scratched. I tried to stay calm, listening for any sign that the police had arrived. The seconds felt like hours as I stood there, clutching a kitchen knife, my only weapon. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens approaching.
The footsteps outside stopped, and I ran to the front door to let the officers in. They quickly searched the yard and the surrounding area, but found no sign of the intruder. They assured me they would patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night. The police stayed with me until my parents returned the next day. They checked the security footage and took my statement, but they never caught the man who tried to break in. The thought that he was still out there somewhere haunted me for a long time. I couldn't shake the feeling that he might return. My parents installed additional security measures, including stronger locks and more cameras, but I never felt completely safe in that house again. Every creak and rustle made me jump, and I couldn't sleep without checking the windows and doors multiple times. The once comforting walls of my home had turned into a cage of anxiety and fear. In the weeks that followed, I found myself growing increasingly paranoid. I would double-check the locks before going to bed and make sure all the curtains were drawn tight. I even started carrying my phone with me everywhere, just in case I needed to call for help again. My friends noticed the change in me and tried to reassure me, but the fear had taken root deep inside. One evening, a few weeks after the incident, I was sitting in the living room with my best friend, Sarah. We were trying to have a normal night, watching a comedy movie and eating popcorn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I would glance at the security monitor, half expecting to see the shadowy figure lurking outside again. As the movie ended, Sarah turned to me and said, "You know, maybe it was just a one-time thing. Maybe he was just some random guy looking for an easy target, and now that the police are involved, he won't come back." I nodded, wanting to believe her, but the image of the man standing by the back door, trying to get in, was burned into my mind. "I hope you're right," I replied, forcing a smile. "But I can't help feeling like he's still out there, watching." That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events over and over in my mind. I wondered who the man was, and what he wanted. Was he a thief, a stalker, or something even more sinister? The not knowing was the worst part. It left my imagination to run wild, conjuring up all sorts of terrifying scenarios.